Deep in the untouched forests of Alaska, where endless trees stand like walls of silence and time itself seems frozen, two workers made a discovery that shook investigators, families, and locals alike. In August of 2022, Mark Collins and Dave Miller were sent to examine old trees in a forgotten sector of the Tongass National Forest. But instead of only trees, they found something far more disturbing. Wedged high above the ground, suspended 12 feet in the air between four massive trunks, was an old wooden cabin that looked as though it had grown into the forest itself. No ladder, no rope, no sign of how anyone could enter it. Driven by curiosity, they climbed up, forced open the weathered door, and stepped into the darkness inside. What they saw would haunt them forever. Against the wall, illuminated by the weak beam of a flashlight, sat the skeleton of a man dressed in the torn remains of hiking clothes. At his feet lay a modern backpack and a pot with traces of food, as if time had stopped years ago. The most chilling sight of all was the cabin door itself. It was nailed shut from the inside, and the wooden boards around it were scarred with desperate fingernail scratches, silent proof of a man fighting to escape. Why would someone trap himself inside? A wooden box in the middle of the forest? And how did a healthy, prepared hiker vanish in 2013, only to be discovered 9 years later in such a horrifying condition? If you want to uncover the answers to these disturbing questions, like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales and let me know from which city and country you are watching this story. Let us complete 5,000 likes on this story so we can bring more hidden and chilling mysteries to light. Mark and Dave, both seasoned foresters, knew they were looking at something far beyond ordinary. The cabin smelled of dampness and decay, its floor covered with pine needles blown in through cracks over the years. The skeleton leaned lifelessly against the wall, its skull lying a short distance away, separated from the rest of the body. The old planks that sealed the door had clearly been hammered in from the inside, bent nails pointing inward as undeniable proof. This was not the work of someone keeping others out. It was the frantic act of someone trying to keep something else away while unknowingly sealing his own fate. Shaken and speechless, Mark climbed down and told Dave only one thing: call the police. With their satellite phone, they managed to send their coordinates, summoning authorities into the heart of the wilderness. Neither of them yet realized that this single discovery would reopen a mystery that had begun nearly a decade earlier with the disappearance of Patrick O'Hara. The chilling discovery inside that hidden cabin had a name, and that name belonged to Patrick O'Hara. To understand how his journey ended in such a terrifying way, we need to return to the summer of 2013. Patrick was a 34-year-old IT specialist from Vancouver. He was not just another tourist looking for adventure. He was a seasoned hiker who had spent years trekking through the forests of British Columbia, learning how to navigate, how to survive, and how to prepare for the unexpected. Careful and methodical both in his work and in his hobbies, Patrick always planned every step of his expeditions in detail. When he arrived in Ketchikan, Alaska, his goal was clear. He wanted to walk through the untouched heart of the Tongass National Forest, a place of dense coniferous trees, endless rain, and fog so heavy it could erase every landmark in minutes. Locals often said the Tongass welcomed strangers easily, but rarely allowed them to leave without a fight. Patrick understood this better than most, and he came ready for the challenge. Before heading out, he stopped at a small tourist and hunting shop near the harbor. The shop owner, Gary, later remembered him as calm and well-prepared. Patrick bought only what he needed: the exact brand of gas canisters for his stove, freeze-dried meals calculated for 10 full days, waterproof matches, and even a new compass, despite already carrying a GPS navigator. To Gary, this was no careless traveler. Patrick knew what he was doing. He paid in cash, adjusted his backpack over his shoulder, and walked out toward his chosen route. That evening, Patrick sent a brief message to his sister back in Vancouver. It was simple, only a few words. heading out on the trail. Everything is according to plan. Next contact in 8 days. For him, it was routine, nothing out of the ordinary. For his family, it was reassurance that he would check in once his path through the wilderness was complete. But what seemed like the beginning of a carefully planned adventure was in truth the first step into a mystery that would grow darker with every passing day. What followed after Patrick's confident start would leave his family waiting in silence, and rescue teams searching desperately in a forest that swallows men whole. Patrick had promised his sister that he would send a message after 8 days. The date was set for July 20th, but the day passed in silence. His family waited patiently, knowing that in the wilderness signals were often impossible. 2 more days went by, and still there was no word. On the morning of July 23rd, his sister could wait no longer. She called the Alaska State Police and reported her brother missing. That single phone call would trigger one of the most difficult searches in the vast Tongass National Forest. Helicopters took to the skies, their blades cutting through the clouds as they tried to spot any sign of Patrick from above. But the thick treetops formed an unbroken roof of green, hiding everything beneath. On the ground, rescue teams moved slowly and carefully, shouting Patrick's name into the silence, firing flares into the sky, hoping for any response. But there was only rain, the cries of birds, and the endless hush of the forest that gave nothing back. Locals who joined the search knew the dangers all too well. In this place, even during summer, a lost person could freeze at night, weakened by rain and exhaustion, and surrounded by bears that roamed the shadows. Days passed, hope grew thinner, and then came a discovery. On the 7th day of the search, deep in a small clearing beside a stream, rescuers found his campsite. At first, it seemed promising, but soon confusion replaced hope. The tent was not left in a hurry. It was carefully rolled up and packed into its compression bag. His backpack was fully assembled, the sleeping bag and mat neatly folded, clothes stacked in order, and food untouched. Everything was in place as if Patrick had planned to leave, but he himself was gone. The ground showed no signs of a struggle. No blood, no torn clothing, not even clear footprints apart from those of the rescuers. It looked as though he had woken one morning, packed up methodically as he always did, placed his belongings neatly together, and then stepped away from the clearing never to return. Search teams scoured every inch around the camp. But there was nothing. No broken branches, no trail, no trace of where he had gone. For another week they searched, fighting rain, fog, and exhaustion. In the end, the search was called off. Patrick O'Hara was officially declared missing. The forest had swallowed him, leaving behind only his well-packed gear and a mystery that felt almost impossible to explain. Years would pass before the silence of the Tongass was broken again, and what was found would be far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. 9 long years passed after Patrick's disappearance. His case had gone cold, his family had been left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions, and the forest kept its silence. But in August of 2022, that silence was broken in the most unsettling way. 2 forestry workers, Mark Collins and Dave Miller, were deep in the Tongass wilderness, far from any marked trails. Their task was to assess the condition of trees that had not been inspected for decades. They expected long days of hard routine. Work, not a discovery that would send chills through everyone who heard it. While pushing through a dense wall of old spruce trees, Mark stopped and happened to glance upward. What he saw froze him in place. Suspended 12 feet above the ground, wedged tightly between 4 massive trunks, was a strange wooden structure. It was too regular, too square to be part of the forest. Covered with moss and weathered by years. Of rain, it looked like a crude cabin, more like a box in the air than a home. There was no ladder, no rope, nothing that explained how anyone could enter. Curiosity took over fear. Both men were experienced climbers and had their gear with them. Mark secured his rope, strapped on climbing spikes, and pulled himself upward. When he reached the cabin, the door resisted, its wood swollen and fragile with age. He forced it open, and a rush of damp, heavy air spilled out. Inside was darkness, but his flashlight beam cut through it, revealing a sight that made his stomach tighten. Leaning against the far wall was a skeleton, still draped in the decayed remains of a blue jacket and dark pants. The floor was scattered with pine needles carried in by the wind. Beside the bones lay a metal pot with a hardened mass of food still. Inside, a rusty old radio and a backpack that looked strangely modern, almost untouched by the years. The strangest and most chilling detail was the door itself. From the inside, thick planks had been nailed across it, sealing it shut. The nails bent inward made it clear that whoever had been inside had locked himself in. On the wood near the door were dozens of deep scratches, clawed into the surface by human fingernails, silent testimony of desperate attempts to escape. Authorities were called in. Forensic teams climbed into the structure and began their careful examination. Among the belongings inside the backpack, they found what confirmed the truth: an identification card with the name Patrick O'Hara. The mystery of his disappearance was no longer about a missing hiker. It had transformed into something far darker, a death trapped inside a cabin in the trees. The discovery answered who was lost, but it raised an even more terrifying question of how he came to be locked in that wooden box in the sky. The discovery of Patrick O'Hara's remains brought the mystery back into focus. But it was the forensic examination that began to reveal the horror of his final days. When investigators opened his backpack, they found something startling. Nearly all of his food supplies were still there, untouched and sealed, along with an unopened gas canister for his stove. This detail alone ruled out starvation. Patrick had not died because he lacked food. Something else had taken his life. Experts studied his bones and discovered the truth of what his body had endured. In that cabin, high above the ground and exposed to damp winds, Patrick had faced freezing nights without his sleeping bag, which was left behind in the abandoned camp miles away. Hypothermia was determined to be the cause of death. The cold and the constant humidity drained his strength day after day, leaving him trapped in a place that offered no warmth and no escape. But there was more, and it was far more troubling. On the back of his skull, in the parietal region, forensic experts found a thin fracture line. It was not the mark of a fall, nor of an accident. It was the clear trace of a blunt force strike, as if Patrick had been hit with a flat object. The injury was not fatal on its own, but it was serious enough to cause confusion, disorientation, and moments of unconsciousness. This discovery painted a grim picture. Patrick had not only been trapped in the cabin, he had been injured before or shortly after entering it. The fingernail scratches on the wood confirmed that he had been conscious at least part of the time. He had fought desperately to escape, clawing at the door he had himself sealed, terrified of something outside, or perhaps terrified of what he remembered before waking in the cabin. The forensic evidence turned a strange disappearance into something even darker. Patrick O'Hara did not simply vanish into the forest. He was struck, left in a freezing prison, and forced to spend his last hours in fear and despair. The question now was whether this terrible end was the result of a tragic accident, or if someone else had placed Patrick in that deadly trap. The forensic findings gave investigators their first path to build a story of what might have happened. The simplest explanation was that Patrick had suffered a tragic accident. Perhaps, after leaving his camp for a short walk, he had lost his bearings in the heavy Alaskan fog. Wandering through the thick forest, he could have stumbled upon the old cabin that hunters or poachers once used. If a rope ladder had been left hanging there, it might have seemed like a stroke of luck. Shelter in the middle of nowhere. He may have climbed up, stepped inside, and in the dim light slipped on the damp floorboards or hit his head against a beam. The fracture in his skull matched such a fall. If he was concussed, he could have been disoriented, unable to think clearly. In that state, He may have knocked the rope ladder away without realizing it, leaving himself stranded above the ground. Panic would have quickly followed. Believing he was in danger or hearing noises outside, he might have grabbed old boards lying in the cabin and nailed the door shut in a frantic attempt to feel safe. Once trapped inside, with no sleeping bag, and no way to light a fire, the cold of the Tongass nights would have slowly drained his life away. It was a version that made sense in many ways, and it explained the scratches, the hypothermia, even the skull fracture. But there were two details that tore the neatness of this theory apart. First, Patrick was known for being methodical. Why? Would he carefully pack up his entire camp, including his sleeping bag and tent, only to set off into the forest without them? That action did not fit the mindset of an experienced hiker who always prepared with caution. Second, the act of barricading himself inside the cabin was deeply puzzling. A man desperate to escape would not spend precious strength sealing the door with nails from the inside. That action spoke of fear, not confusion. It suggested that Patrick was not simply lost and hurt. He was hiding from something or someone outside. The accident theory explained many things, but it left behind a shadow of doubt, a shadow that pointed toward a darker possibility. The flaws in the accident theory forced investigators to look at the case from another angle, one that was far more sinister. If Patrick had not trapped himself by mistake, then perhaps someone else had a hand in his fate. In the wilderness of the Tongass, far from trails and patrols, the most likely encounter would have been with poachers. For decades, illegal hunters had used the forest to hide their activities, and some had even built elevated shelters like the very cabin where Patrick was found. Investigators began to imagine the sequence of events. Patrick had left his camp, his belongings neatly packed either by his own choice or because someone forced him to do so. As he walked deeper into the woods, he may have stumbled upon fresh evidence of poaching, perhaps even the carcass of a deer. At that moment, he could have crossed paths with armed men who were not expecting to meet a hiker. For Patrick, it was a chance encounter. For the poachers, it was a disaster. If he reported them, their hidden camps, weapons, and kills would be exposed. They could not allow that. A confrontation would have followed. Patrick may have tried to assure them he would not say a word, but trust was impossible. At some point, one of them struck him with the butt of a rifle or another blunt object. The head injury confirmed that violence had taken place. Wounded and disoriented, Patrick was now a problem they needed to solve quietly. Shooting him would draw attention, but the cabin offered another solution. They dragged or forced him up the rope ladder into the wooden box in the trees. Once inside, Patrick may have regained enough awareness to realize the danger he was in. Terrified, he heard their voices outside, voices of men who had already decided his fate. In a frantic effort to save himself, Patrick turned the old boards inside the cabin into a barricade, hammering them across the door with desperate strength. He thought he was building protection, but in truth he was building a trap from which there was no escape. The poachers below heard the hammering. They realized what he had done, and it suited them. They simply pulled the ladder away and walked off, knowing that the forest and the cold would finish what they had started. This theory explained what the accident theory could not. It explained the perfectly packed camp. It explained the injury on his skull. Most of all, it explained the strange and desperate act of barricading the door from the inside. But there was a problem investigators could not overcome. With 9 years gone, every trace of evidence that could prove this theory had vanished. No fingerprints, no weapons, no witnesses, and no names. The truth of Patrick's fate now pointed toward human hands, but the silence of the forest still kept those hands hidden.